new development, when in fact we have been growing our own bombers here for years. Indeed, we have a whole evening dedicated to one. It's called Guy Fawkes Night. Meanwhile, the government has frowned upon Pakistani arranged marriages to foreigners, while somehow forgetting that arranged marriage forms the basis for many a British literary classic, and that of the 6 British monarchs of the last century, 5 married foreigners, and most of those unions were arranged. Following rioting by black and French Arab youth in France in 2007, Jacques Maillard, a nationalist deputy, explained the disturbances thus. The problem is not economic, he said. The reality is not economic. The reality is that an anti-French ethno-cultural bias from a foreign society has taken root on French soil. Well, the French may need to import many things, from trashy popular films to fast food, but the one thing they have long produced themselves is a culture of riotous assembly. There is nothing foreign about rioting in France. The country was built on a riot. All of which is to say that, for better or for worse, Muslims in Europe are far more European than many of their fellow Europeans care to admit. Given the colonial links, the prevalence of Western culture in the global arena, and the power of the Western economy, this should really come as no surprise. For many, it's the only place they know. And yet here, each time a terror cell is found, the media gasp at the discovery that the bombers, or potential bombers, played cricket, worked in chip shops, and supported Manchester United. So those who exist at the margins have little option but to be aware of their marginality, while those who occupy the centre have the luxury of assuming that people, if not aware of their experiences, at the very least should be. When you're my size and being tormented by elevator buttons, water fountains and ATMs, you spend your life accommodating the sensibilities of normal people, says Katie Roth, the protagonist of Restricted Growth from Armistead Lopin's novel, Maybe the Moon. You learn to bury your own feelings and honour theirs in the hope that they will meet you halfway. It becomes your job and yours alone to explain, to ignore, to forgive over and over again. There's no way you can get round this. You do it if you want to have a life and not spend it being corroded by your own anger. You do it if you want to belong to the human race. But all too often those at the core do not see the need to meet people halfway and thereby fail to recognise that everyone else is doing all the travelling. For them, being at the core is an objective position in itself. It lends them not a perspective, but an orthodoxy in which every food with which they are unfamiliar is ethnic food, and every month is their history month. Every human being at every stage of history is born into society and from his earliest years is moulded by that society, argued noted historian E.H. Carr. Both language and environment help to determine the character of his thought. His earliest ideas come from others. His first words come from others. The individual, apart from society, would be both speechless and mindless. We all have an identity. In fact, we all have several. And denial in this regard raises 2 crucial problems. First, that those at the core are likely to remain more likely to remain cripplingly unaware of their bias. Second, that the inability to recognise and interrogate one's own perspective paves the way for those experiences to be evoked not as an identity, but as a grievance. The only people perceived to talk about whiteness in Britain are the BNP. Similarly, it's left to the fox hunters in popular perception to defend the countryside and Daily Mail to talk about Middle England. Each in their own way will evoke the threat of marginalisation as a pretext to build a fortress around the core. And this sense of siege usually demands a bespoke reality. Every victim needs an aggressor, and every aggressor needs a tool of oppression. And in the event that these don't exist, they will be invented. In this case, the aggressor is usually the liberal establishment, and the instrument of control is political correctness. Given the rightward shift in politics and economics over the last 30 years, it's difficult to work out quite where this liberal establishment resides. If any of you find it, I would very much like to join it. Finding a working definition of political correctness is also not easy, which gives it the added benefit of meaning anything you want it to mean, so long as you don't like it. In the space of 1 month in 2006, Political correctness was used in the British press on average 10 times a day, twice as frequently as Islamophobia, 3 times as often as homophobia, 4 times as often as sexism. During that period, it referred to everything from the ill treatment of rabbits, the teaching of Gaelic, Mozart's opera La Clemenza di Tito, a flower show in Paris, and the naming of the Mazda 3 MPS. But what people are generally complaining about are constraints on their behaviour, on their rights to be offensive and insensitive without consequence. In the past, racially derisive remarks, comments about your female colleagues' breasts, or spastic jokes were considered part and parcel of daily banter both in and outside the workplace. Now they're not. We've abandoned them for the same reason that we no longer burn witches at the stake or stick orphan children in the poorhouse. We have moved on. Values change, societies develop, and their language and behaviour evolves with them. That's not political correctness, but social and political progress. It was not imposed by liberal diktat, but established by civic consensus. Which brings us to my final point, that the relationship between the margins and the core are in constant flux. And while specific changes have to be assessed on their merits, opposition to the very idea of change is untenable, since it would be contingent on people's lives, capacities and aspirations standing still. Cultural identities come from somewhere. They have histories, argues Stuart Hall. But like everything which is historical, they undergo constant transformation. Far from being eternally fixed in some essentialized past, they are subject to the continuous play of history, culture and power. Now, precisely how and when these shifts in people and societies happen is often difficult to fathom. It could be a century, a generation, or if we think about how America changed after 9/11, a day. But even those single events do not appear out of a clear blue sky. More often than not, when identities change, they are the product of organic processes that shift the plates of ingrained prejudice, institutional power, popular presumption, orthodoxy, and common sense over time at such a glacial pace that we barely notice them until they have changed form entirely. While time may facilitate change, though, it can't do it by itself. The principal reason why the relationship between the core and the margins change is because people make it change. Power concedes nothing without a demand, said Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist. It never has, and it never will. There will be always those who are resistant to these changes, not on their merits, but in principle. But in order to enforce their worldview, they must perform 3 solipsistic manoeuvres. First, they must distort history. For if something is essentially unchanging, then it must be the same now as it ever was. Second, they must quash all speculation about their future. For if it's essentially unchanging, then it can never be different. Both of these stances come together in arguments around gay marriage. As Andrew Sullivan argued in The New Republic, if marriage were the same today as it has been for 2,000 years, it would be possible to marry a 12-year-old you had never met, to own wife as property, and dispose of her at will, or to imprison a person who married someone of a different race, and it would be impossible to get a divorce. But then there's the third manoeuvre, which is to ignore all the other changes that happen around them. One of the reasons that opinions about gay lifestyles have changed is because views on straight lifestyles have undergone a radical shift also. Between the 50s and today, divorce rates more than doubled in the US, and the age at which people got married climbed nearer 30 than 20. Meanwhile, between the 60s and 2005, the percentage of births to unmarried women increased 7-fold. In a world where people don't stay married, feel the need to get married, to have children, or have children when they are married, the link between marriage and procreation, sanctity and fidelity are at least attenuated and, for the most part, completely broken. Such is the defence of tradition, not to make an argument, but simply repeat a fact. So to conclude, there is an inherent tension in the relationship between the margins and the core. How could there not be? It's a tension in part shaped by a battle for definition and in part by a struggle for resources, a strain between who we are and what we need. Power, resources and opportunity are in play in how we choose to understand or misunderstand the value of ourselves and others. Now, there's little to be gained by fetishizing this tension. First of all, if managed the right way, it can be extremely creative. Insensitivity never achieved much. Baiting, ridiculing and humiliating are poor substitutes for satire, irony and humour, although they often masquerade as such. When they are employed by the powerful against the powerless, it's not clever, but cowardly. But oversensitivity never achieved much either. Not every nuance, challenge, wordplay and ignorance is a slight. Not every slight is worthy of escalating into an incident, and not every provocation need be indulged. Just because someone claims marginality does not mean they have to be believed, or that they cannot also have other powers at the core. Identity is a crucial place to start and a terrible place to finish. But there is little to be gained by ignoring it either. The relationship between the two, the margins and the core, is not only symbiotic but unresolved. And while there is great opportunity for anxiety in this, there is also the potential for creativity as well. Pretending that power relationships are not there does not make them go away. It simply means you refuse to see them. I have a 3-year-old, and when his friends' parents tell me that their child doesn't see skin colour, I usually tell them to get their kids' eyes tested. They're supposed to see colour. In all sorts of ways, our differences make a difference. And in any case, it's not the difference that is the problem. It's what people choose to make of that difference. The journey between the margins and the core is one that most of humanity makes every day, be it geographically, culturally, linguistically, or politically. Whether it's a middle-class white kid listening to hip-hop or an immigrant worker coming into central London from the outskirts to clean offices. The best we can do is travel from A to B safely and intelligently with due regard for our fellow passengers, in the knowledge that without A, there would be no B, and that neither A nor B will necessarily be in the same place when we come to make the return trip. Thanks very much.